all sitting comfortably. Let's dive in. Zechariah. And do feel free to follow along in the Bibles on your seats. I think it's about page 952. Anybody got it? No? Anybody got a page number for Zechariah? 950. Oh, there we go. I wasn't far off. Yeah, 950. Okay. So if you want to follow along in the pew Bibles, seat Bibles. Any of you ever been in a moment in your life where you feel completely stumped? That crossroads type feeling where you've come up to something and you've realized, I just don't know how I can get through this. And you kind of feel, have I got to reinvent myself? Is like my identity gone? Like, what do you do at those moments? I hope none of you have ever experienced something like that, but you may well have done. And if you have, then you're going to be able to understand a little bit more simply how Judah were feeling in the context of Zechariah. To put it politely, Judah were seriously discouraged. Now, last week we were in Haggai, and Zechariah's prophesying around about the same time, so think 520 BC. You remember I gave you some exact days last week with Haggai when we know that he preached. Pretty awesome history to be able to know the exact day he preached in 520 BC. It's not that straightforward with Zechariah, but we know he's preaching at the same time. And so with that history, we know that in 538 BC, the Persian ruler Cyrus had allowed Judah to return to Jerusalem. And he had graciously encouraged them to start building their city walls and their temple. And Zechariah and Haggai were amongst that first wave of returning exiles. And yet this enormous turn of fortunes and blessing, as we were learning last week, very quickly became deadened. So less than 20 years in, work on the temple had completely stalled. And it may well be that we would have found, a Judean at that time, kind of daydreaming, looking maybe at the foundation work that had been done on the temple, and in a moment of daydream, they'd lost themselves thinking, oh, what could be? What could be with this temple? And then maybe they'd heard a squawking bird, and it had woken them up out of that daydream. And in the reality, in the physical, they had been reminded that actually it was just foundation work. Looked like a load of rubble, really. It hadn't been finished, completely stalled. So they were discouraged. And in past overviews, we spent quite a bit of time actually in the Old Testament at various points, certainly with the exiles returning, talking about building projects that have lagged behind time. And I know some of you who have experienced that with extensions and so on, and a builder gets sick and then another builder gets sick, or there's problems with the paperwork or whatever. It's really frustrating. But actually, I think this goes a lot deeper than that. Because this building, the temple, is right at the center of identity for what it means to be Jewish. And so they might have been asking that question, without their temple, who am I? Like, how do I fit in again to this world? Because I used to have a really clear identity that was wrapped around with God in the temple. Who am I? Who are we as a Jewish people? Has God forgotten about us? And in this church, if you didn't know, we have quite a big asylum seeker community. They've become part of a family. We have the Best Western Hotel. Best Western Hotels around the country have done deals with the government whereby they're housing asylum seekers. And just with the nation of Iran, we have a Monday night Farsi speaking Bible study now where we've got between 20 and 30 coming along to that. It's incredible work. And many of them have fled Iran because of their faith. They've been persecuted. They've ended up here. They're very dear to us. We're humbled by their stories. But I guess for them, they've been incredibly discouraged. They've had to run for their lives, and they thought, wow, I've got freedom here in this country. And then, before they know it, they've been sat in front of an interview, and all of the anxiety and the stress, just trying to get a visa, trying to get refugee status in here, going from asylum seeker to refugee status. And very often, if their English isn't very good, they have to rely on an interpreter. Sometimes that doesn't go too well because the interpreter doesn't believe that they've actually become a Christian. They think maybe it's just all for show. Constant discouragements. And then maybe they're lucky, blessed, and they get given a visa, but then all of a sudden they have 5 weeks to find housing. And again, if they can't speak English very well, then they can't make sense of this letter that the Home Office has sent them. And so they realize, in the last week of that 5-week period, you're being kicked out of the hotel tomorrow night. And then they have the prospect of homelessness because they haven't got anything sorted. Discouragement again. And you can imagine them asking these same questions. I need to reinvent myself. What do I do? Who am I? How am I going to live in this society when I'm not familiar with all of its customs and so on? So I think it goes a bit deeper than just a building project that's been lagging behind. It's about identity. It's about having something ripped away from you and trying to re-find yourself. That gets to the heart of Zechariah. Judah, they had hoped that their new temple would surpass its former glory, yet it lay in ruins. They had hoped Jerusalem would be a shining light to the nations, but instead they barely featured on a map. And they had longed for prosperity, like in the days of Solomon. Instead, with Persia building up a campaign against Egypt, the taxes were really, really high. So there's this feeling going on. Maybe spiritual apathy started to creep in. God must have forgotten about us. What do we do now? Well, let's not waste more time on this and money on this temple. Let's just move on with our lives, reinvent ourselves. Can't labor the feeling strongly enough. Judah's identity was wrapped up in the temple. Zechariah really was preaching to a discouraged people. And yet, interestingly, like last week with Haggai, the overwhelming message of Zechariah is one of huge encouragement and inspiration and looking up. Some of you, you've had a long break maybe from going to the gym, and you're like, I'm going to get back to the gym. How do you do it? How do you get back there when you don't have much motivation to get back there if you lost the rhythm? How do you do it? Well, you just put one foot in front of the other, right? And you somehow get there. That's how new rhythms start. And so Zechariah says, into that kind of mindset, chapter 4, verse 10, don't despise the day of small things. And then he goes on to say, have faith, remember who you are, chapter 1, verse 3, return to me, and I will return to you. It's a simple message, just to start now. Maybe tonight, you're coming along and you think, I've been drifting from the Lord. Today's the day of salvation, tonight's the night of salvation. God says to you simply and clearly, return to me, and I'll return to you. I want you in my life right now. Come back to me. Tonight's the best time to do it. Come back to me. This book is a great reminder to us, especially living this side of the cross, because we know Jesus struggled. We know that God still has a plan for us when we struggle. But anyway, that's a little introduction to the overarching themes of Zechariah and its context. And as mentioned at the start, this is the longest of the minor prophets. A huge source of inspiration for the New Testament, over 54 passages popping up in at least 67 places in the New Testament. And to do something of justice tonight, I wanted to take you on a kind of whistle-stop tour, like a bus journey, and pull in a few times and just pause to fuel off of some of the beautiful truths and teaching that Zechariah offers us. And I had created this cool image, which I've completely forgotten, and I'm really sorry. It was a bus going on a journey, and my 5 kind of points were coming off the different stops of the bus made. But hey-ho, we'll just crack on. So I'm going to dive straight in there, and this is a chance for us to just refuel, maybe even if our tanks are full tonight. It's always good to fuel and have it right high to the max of your fuel level, because you don't know when a long journey where there's no gas station is going to come, right? Stop 1 then. I'm going to read verses 1 to 6, and I've titled this stop, Journey with the Lord. So chapter 1, verses 1 to 6. In the 8th month, in the 2nd year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Zechariah, son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo. The Lord was very angry with your ancestors. Therefore tell the people, this is what the Lord Almighty says, return to me, declares the Lord Almighty, and I will return to you, says the Lord Almighty. Do not be like your ancestors, to whom the earlier prophets proclaimed, this is what the Lord Almighty says, turn from your evil ways and your evil practices. But they would not listen or pay attention to me, declares the Lord. Where are your ancestors now? And the prophets, do they live forever? But did not my words and my decrees, which I commanded my servants, the prophets, overtake your ancestors? Then they repented and said, the Lord Almighty has done to us what our ways and practices deserve, just as he determined to do. So, it's clear lessons from the past that Yahweh the Lord wants Judah to hear. Clear instructions. And not listening to instructions when we're on a journey can be devastating. I was thinking of all the times in the last 10 years I've boarded a flight, and it comes to that point whilst you're standing on the runway where the air hostesses will be doing their thing when they're like, the toilets are this way and that way, and they'll be talking you through how to put the masks on. And I feel for them. As a preacher, very often when I'm preaching, I'm looking at the congregation, and people have different listening faces. Like this. But I feel for the hostesses because they're not only contending with listening faces, they're contending with like kids that don't want anything to do with them. They're contending with parents who have headphones listening to their music. Just so happens, nobody listens to those instructions, do they? Put your hand up if you've zoned out in an air hostess. Yeah, we all do it. And yet, could save our life, could be quite important. Well, that's what Judah have done with God's word. It's really important stuff that he wants to say. Nah, headphones in, earplugs in, done their own thing. And so they found themselves in exile. And yet God says again, and I've mentioned it a few times tonight, he says, return to me. Right now, listen, wake up on your journey, return to me, and I'll return to you. He's the God of second, third, fourth, umpteen chances. First thing we need to do if we're going to journey through life well is listen to God. Know his purpose, his security. We know that when we listen to him. And we need, therefore, there's a challenge here. We need to let his words have more space in our lives than the zillions of other words we hear every day. We need to let his words have more of a say than what the world says, than what our spouse says, than what our boss at work says. There's challenges there. As verses 5 and 6 make it clear, other influences in our life, they don't live forever. Only God does. Ellie, my wife, and I, we were at this marriage retreat day yesterday. Really good day down at Waverley Abbey. And one of the interesting things, I think, in the last 3-4 years that the marriage course and other marriage courses have started introducing into their content is the use of phones. Phones have now become a problem. Some of you are laughing to one another. There's a problem in marriages with phones. Because our spouse, wants our attention, and yet it's all too easy to just, get the phone out at dinner table, I'll just quickly check the message. And the speakers yesterday were saying, very often, even in the bedroom, sitting there, maybe we've just read a book, and get the phone out, either social media or just messaging. And in that moment, we're inviting other people into the bedroom. So you're saying there's this correlation between marriages struggling and the use of phones. Well, church, let's not forget that we are the bride of Christ. Listen to him rather than constantly letting Facebook re-story us away from the story maker. Let's find ourselves in his word. Let's not let our hearts become diamond hard, like it says in Zechariah chapter 7, verse 12. Instead, let's return to him. Because when we do, he'll return to us. That's a Bible promise. It's awesome. Second stop, that was the first stop. First stop was journeying with the Lord. The second stop is chapter 2, verses 1 to 5. And this I've titled, God's Hope Has No Limits. God's hope has no limits. Verses 1 to 5, chapter 2. Then I looked up, and there before me was a man with a measuring line in his hand. I asked, "Where are you going?" And he answered me, "To measure Jerusalem, to find out how wide and how long it is." While the angel who was speaking to me was leaving, another angel came to meet him and said to him, "Run, tell that young man, Jerusalem will be a city without walls because of the great number of people and animals in it. And I myself will be a wall of fire around it, declares the Lord, and I will be its glory within." Awesome verses. As I've been doing with all the other books of the Bible, just a really quick outline. Should have said at the start that chapters 1 to 6 consist of 8 visions Zechariah has, reminding Judah that God is working for her good. And then those visions are concluded in chapters 7 to 8. And the rest of the book, it consists of 2 oracles concerning the Messianic kingdom. So chapters 9 to 11 are about a coming king who's also a rejected shepherd. Sound familiar? Chapters 12 to 14 are about how this shepherd restores justice, filthy hearts, and Jerusalem to being a new Garden of Eden. Pretty awesome. It's the whole message of the Bible in this book. It's an epic read. The challenge for you later on tonight or the rest of this week is to read through it and to count up how many times you see Jesus. And excuse the pun there. I've talked in accountancy language of counting up. There's even a reference to the 30 pieces of silver. Jesus on every page. Anyway, back to verses 1 to 5. Here we find ourselves in vision number 3. I mentioned 8 visions. This is the 3rd vision. And it's all about the scope of Jerusalem. By the way, Jerusalem is mentioned over 40 times in this book. And I think this is because a lot of Judah's discouragement stems from the fact that Jerusalem and the temple don't look as great as they should look, as they'd hoped. In their minds, I remember coming up this line before I came to London, so no offense. But in their minds, the temple looks more like Kennington than Kensington. Now, it's so discredit if you're living in Kennington. I'm thinking more like the architecture rather than the coolness of the people there, okay? So don't hate me. But they feel small and they feel insignificant, not like they should feel if they're really the center of God's hopes for the world. So what does God do? Well, he breathes hope into their hopelessness. He says that Jerusalem will be like an ever-growing suburbia that can't have rigid walls because they'd have to be knocked down time and time again, rebuilt constantly because of the constant expansion. In fact, the Lord himself is saying, you talk about glory right at the start, Julie, the Lord himself is going to be there as a fire of cloud. That will be the wall, like utter security. How cool is that? That the Lord himself is the wall around the place where you live. Cannot imagine greater security and protection. And we, as New Testament people, we've got to remember that this points beyond the physical temple. This points to the spiritual temple, the church. We're being invited to be living stones with Christ as the foundation. And personally here, right this moment, I'm buzzing at All Saints because I feel, for quite a while now, but certainly 2025 kicked off with a bang, and there seems to be a buzz here. There's loads happening. People are coming up with a big appetite, and we're like, yeah, our vision, it includes fasting. That's great. We're going to do a bit of fasting for the Lord because we want to devote ourselves to him, and loads of other things. In the last 3 weeks, we've had 4 recommitments or commitments to the Lord, and we're singing. Hearing about some of the youth going prayer walking, and Tessa, you're here, but me in you, and just you feeling built up by the Lord just through that instance. That's God engineered. So there's so much to give thanks for right now. And yet, alongside that, all too often, we so easily let discouragement have more of a say in our lives than we need to. Sometimes with that attitude, we can limit what God is capable of. We can start saying, why isn't this evening service bursting at the seams? Friends, we remember the parable of the mustard seed. And we remember that God's hope has no limits. Stop 3. This is chapter 3, verses 1 to 10. I'm just going to read verses 1 to 2. But I've titled this third stop, "The Branch Stumps the Accuser and Wipes Away Sin." Say that again. The branch stumps the accuser and wipes away sin. I'm using the language in these verses. So verses 1 to 2 of chapter 3. "Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And the Lord said to Satan, 'The Lord rebuke you, O Satan. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you.'" This is now the 4th vision. It's a great vision for us to glimpse just for a moment or two. The fact that God has ultimate authority over Satan. And I'm sure you know that the Bible is unashamed of speaking about the reality of Satan. Christians, we're unashamed of speaking about the reality of the spiritual realm. There's Satan, demons, his minions, alive and active, prowling around. Anyway, there's Satan in this image, and he's in front of God, and he's pointing the finger at Joshua the high priest at the time, and he's hurling all sorts of insults and accusations at him. And God basically says here, just shut up. Just shut it. Satan, familiar bush. Shut up. Basically what he says. Stop speaking. And Satan is so deceiving. Maybe you'll know some of the tactics that he's had in your life. Come and try and deceive you on your journey through life, various times, various ways. But it'll almost always come along and appear to be a best friend, appear to have a best interest at heart. Like the White Witch in Narnia, like she was to Edmund. He'll offer us what we think we want, a Turkish delight. We think we want it, we think we need it, a pay rise. If we take that slightly dubious line on our tax return, or maybe a passionate romance, if we have an affair, respect and superiority, if just a bit harsher with our words. Again, at this marriage retreat yesterday, we talked about 10 seconds. Very often we've got about 10 seconds to make a good decision when 2 options are set in front of us. And I was just thinking about this with King David. Remember his adultery with Bathsheba? And we read in the Old Testament, at a time when kings would normally be at war. So first off, he wasn't caught up in his usual rhythm. He was having a break from that. Probably just had a bit of a doze, feeling a bit sleepy. And then he goes up on his lovely veranda and he sees down below this beautiful figure of a naked woman. And in that moment, 10 seconds. He's got 10 seconds. What do I do? Do I go back inside, have a cold shower, do some press-ups, have a run? Or do I just linger? Don't make the decision, I'll just linger. Not doing anything wrong, I'll just have another glance and just linger. And unfortunately, you know the rest of the story. Lingering in Satan's presence is a dangerous thing. He's a liar. And he appears to offer what we want, but it always comes with a hook. He's two-faced. As soon as we give in to his advances, he turns from being our friend to our accuser, and he shouts to God, "Look what he's just done. Isn't he filthy? Condemn him." He's not true to you. Coming back to our passage, we might be saying, why Joshua the high priest? Well, it's because Joshua the high priest symbolizes all God's people. And God is saying to Satan, shut up with all your accusations about my people. With all of the accusations that you hurl over each one of my people in here, all saints this evening. Shut up, Satan, because they're mine. And we might forget what grace is. We might try in our own strength to rub off some of those nasty accusations we felt him speak over us. Can't do it. It's only by grace, being washed in his blood. Once again, Jesus wants you tonight to know he's the only one who could condemn you, not Satan, and yet he loves you. And he died for you. I talked about the branch, and he keeps on popping up in these verses. It's by bringing his servant the branch, whereby sin and Satan is smashed. We read of the branch loads of times, and it's with the branch, again in verse 9, where we're told God can remove all iniquity. And that's just not your iniquity, that's all the world's iniquity from generation to generation. He can remove it all through this branch in one day. We're told that in Zechariah 3 verse 9. I've mentioned that Zechariah is the most quoted Old Testament book in the Gospels. And with this branch, we're filled with the hope of Jesus, because he comes along, and what does he say? He says, I am the true vine. And that implies that every spiritual branch grows from him. We're engrafted into him. He's the vine with the branches. We're in him. We're in him. It's a future us in the book of Zechariah, because we find ourselves in Jesus. And then furthermore, on the cross, he bore the sin of all sinners in one day. It is finished, he cried. Not, I am finished. It is finished. All of the condemnation sin deserves in one day. Imagine the majesty of Jesus. When was the last time you just fell flat on your face, just in awe of Jesus, his majesty? Wipe all sin in one day. Stop 4, and I like this as well because it flows from what I've just been saying. I've titled this, Wickedness Shall Be No More. Wickedness shall be no more. This is chapter 5, verses 5 to 11. And then the angel who talked with me came forward and said, look up and see what is appearing. I asked, what is it? He replied, it's a basket. And he added, this is the iniquity of the people throughout the land. Then the cover of lead was raised, and there in the basket sat a woman. He said, this is wickedness. And he pushed her back into the basket and pushed its lead cover down on it. Then I looked up, and there before me were 2 women with the wind in their wings. They had wings like those of a stork, and they lifted up the basket between heaven and earth. Where were they taking the basket? I asked the angel who was speaking to me. He replied, to the country of Babylonia, to build a house for it. When the house is ready, the basket will be set there in its place. Now, this is the 7th vision, and I think this is one of my favorite. I love the imagery of this vision as this basket, and I'm sure if we'd had looked at it like Zechariah was called to, we'd have probably thought it contained a picnic, maybe, picnic and some blankets in it or something like that. But he opens it up and out pops the head of this old lady. And I like to picture her with a long, warty nose and a witch's cackle. And I think of like a poster of one of those old Wicked musical posters that you might see on the London Underground. I know it's been updated recently with the Hollywood kind of blockbuster, but think of those old Wicked posters with the green witch's face on. Anyway, this witch pops her head up, and then Zechariah sees this angel slam that leaden cover shut. Get back in there. I love it. This woman personifies wickedness. And the next thing we see is these other two women flying wickedness in her basket back to Babylonia. In the translation that I was reading, it was Shinar, a place in Babylonian, and Jews would have heard that as a place far, far away. We go on with that kind of musical, lyrical, far, far away. They were flying her far, far, they were flying wickedness far, far away. Wickedness shall be no more, far away from God's people. Reminds me of that verse in Revelation depicting heaven. We're told, there shall be no more mourning. Why? There's no more sin and wickedness. It's those things that lead to mourning. God will wipe away every tear and will dwell with him forever. I don't know why wickedness here is personified as a woman, but there's lots in these visions that are left to our imagination. I think God wants us to continue like reading them and just sitting in them and saying, Lord, like teach me more, teach me more, teach me more. It could be that wickedness is personified as female because of the pagan fertility goddess Asherah, who many Judeans had gone off to worship. Likewise, wickedness could be female because the men falling into sin with many foreign wives. I don't know. But it is this image we find popping up again and again. We see it in Revelation as well with Babylon pictured as a female prostitute. I wonder how disheartened you are when you read the news and there's another shooting in a church in the States, something like that. And for this reason, my wife, she's fasting from reading the BBC app. She has an email sent to her, loads of good news. But anyway, I wonder how disheartened you get. It really gets in there. It makes me sad when I read about this stuff. I wonder too how often we mourn our own sin. The cheap words, the gossip that come from our own lips. Or when we think of how outrageous and contemptuous our proud thoughts are that often float around our mind. Sometimes, I'm sure I don't speak for myself, but I feel dirty. I know I'm washed, but I feel dirty because of these thoughts. Friends, without God, there would be no end to any of that and that thinking and those thoughts. He is our only hope. And only with him, in his beautiful new kingdom, wickedness and all of those thoughts that it produces will be no more. We have a glorious future prepared for us. Final stop. Stop 5. This is chapter 8, verses 22 to 23. Share God's big vision. Let me read those verses. Chapter 8, verse 22 to 23. And many peoples and powerful nations will come to Jerusalem to seek the Lord Almighty and to entreat him. This is what the Lord Almighty says. In those days, 10 people from all languages and nations will take firm hold of one Jew by the hem of his robe and say, let us go with you, because we have heard that God is with you. God has just been urging Judah to pursue truth and flee from evil. And here he says that when that happens, blessings will follow. When we follow God's commands, life makes all the more sense. Things just seem to fit into place. And when the world sees this, when the world sees us collectively doing this as a church, the world wants in. I love this imagery. Verse 23 of a foreigner grabbing a Jew and being like, I'm with him. I'm with this guy. I want what you've got. Now, our prayer for this church is that your non-Christian friends, they say that of you. You're coming here and you're getting fired up and you're going back into your neighborhoods and you've got neighbors grabbing you. I'm like, I want what you've got. I see like something different in you. There's a radiance to you and you're like, yeah, it's Jesus. Don't be surprised if you're choosing to follow Jesus and surrendering to him in some of life's difficult decisions, and people are seeing you do that. Don't be surprised when they grab you and say, I want that. Gospel is the best news in the world. We so often live on the back foot as Christians, thinking that we'll be sidelined for our faith. Just being asked earlier, Greg, did you lose loads of friends when you became a Christian because you were in that kind of rugby culture? And we have this mentality, like, oh, we're following the narrow way after all. We are going to be surprised. When we get to heaven, we're going to be surprised by just how full it is. Because that's the heart of our Father. I remember a friend phoning me up and joking to me, and he was like, we're going to find the likes of you there, Greg. I was like, yeah. We're going to be surprised, friends, because our God's good. And Jesus said, in my Father's house are many rooms. So be encouraged. Shine brightly for him this week. Well, friends, that is our whistle-stop tour of Zechariah. I hope that it's whetted your appetite to read on some more. God has more than enough power to restore your hope if you've been feeling a little bit hopeless this week. He's got so much elation to give you if you're feeling discouraged. Question for Judah, question for us, is whether we believe it and whether we'll act on it. Return to me, and I will return to you, declares the Lord. You going to trust him? You trust him this week? One last image I share with you as I close. And this is for those of us, we're fighting to trust him this week. And he says this, chapter 10, verse 8, he says, God will whistle to his sheep. And like obedient dogs, we will hear the whistle and come to him. And it reminds us of what Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice and they follow me. Let me close with a prayer. Jesus, unblock our ears. Thank you for the journey that you've called us onto, that we've just experienced a glimpse of as we've been looking at Zechariah. Thank you that you want to journey with us. Thank you that you invite us to journey with you. And thank you that you're a speaking God, that you're speaking to us this evening. You're speaking to us right now. We pray that by the power of your Spirit, you'd help us to zone out of the other voices that have been trying to grab our attention. Help us to tune into your frequency. Help us to make more of a concerted effort. Lead us by the way of grace. We can't do on our own. Lead us to make the right choices. To tune into your frequency, your whisper, or maybe your shout. Speak to us. Speak to us tonight as we go home, as we lie in our beds, trying to get to sleep, with the only thing that keeps us up. Not be worry or anxiety about what the week holds, with the only thing, if we're going to stay up tonight, that keeps us up is your voice. You're laying something on our heart. Please mold and shape us now. We're your people. We love you. Thank you for Zechariah.